And so we've seen all this stuff, right? Growth at the edge. This is within 30 miles. Low density residential, this is not within 30 miles, but single use residential, very typical. And of course that type of residential development tends to be served by this type of commercial development, as well as commercial highway strips. And again, feeding into that auto-oriented design. And when you pack all these together, you get a certain type of development pattern that's highly impactful. And it really spreads out the impacts of development. More and more impervious surfaces, more runoff, more erosion, sedimentation, loss of habitat. And the EPA did a phenomenal study a few years ago that looked at these and looked at the watershed implications and said, well, what if we looked at a development pattern, different development patterns for the same amount of growth? And so what they said is, let's look at 10,000 housing units built on at different densities. And so scenario A shows 10,000 houses built on 10,000 acres, so 1 unit per acre, right? And so on a 10,000 acre watershed, pretty much the whole thing was covered up by development, by single acre development. And then scenario B said, okay, well, let's do the same, but let's condense that a little bit, go higher density, and see what happens. And you can see that there was, the watershed impact is reduced because that development footprint is shrunk down. And as it turns out, the stormwater impacts are reduced as well. At a site level, per house, there was actually a little bit more impervious surface because there was a slightly higher intensity development. But at the watershed scale, there was a reduction in impervious cover and a reduction in stormwater runoff. And then in scenario C, that's the highest density scenario, you see that the implications are much better for the watershed. It's really, the development footprint is really shrunk down. So the lower density scenario created more runoff, consumed more land, and that healthy natural infrastructure that we need in the watershed than the higher density scenario. Looking at this as well on our water supplies, as it turns out larger lots and lower density development patterns increase water demand. This is largely due to the demand for residential outdoor landscaping, but not only that. There's an old classmate of mine from high school. A study in Utah looked at this and actually found a 50% reduction in water demand simply by going from 2 units to the acre to 5 units to the acre, neither of which are really very high density. And in Seattle, a similar study showed a 67% increase in density, going from 4 to 12 units per acre resulted in a 60% decrease in water use. So that's another implication. And of course, you know, for local governments, this can be a fiscal and infrastructure nightmare as well. Just serving these places is really a challenge, and for water management agencies as well. The more spread out the development pattern, the more difficult it is to send transmission lines and piping, and there tends to be greater water loss from leakage. And so all of these things sort of compound those problems. And then in increasingly rural development patterns, we start to see a greater number of sewer and septic systems which have their own set of problems, right? Because we're pumping more and more groundwater and we're not really monitoring how much. And then of course we've got the impacts of septic systems. And the one thing we typically know about septic systems is a quote from a friend of mine at the EPA is, they all fail at some point. So the upshot is we're paving over our watersheds, stressing our infrastructure, using water inefficiently, and we're losing that good stuff. So that's the depressing part of my presentation. Now for some principles that many of you all are going to be familiar with. There are really 3 things that I break this down into in terms of, you know, what are water-wise planning principles? How can we grow in a more water-friendly manner? And it comes down to more sustainable development patterns. How can we improve the character and pattern of our development? Protecting that natural infrastructure. How can we protect the health of the watershed by protecting those open areas that remain? And then in places where we do develop, what type of design strategies can we apply to minimize the impacts of future development? So I'm going to start with, well actually, I want to start by saying none of these things happen in isolation, and really one of the challenges that I think we have in trying to promote sustainable development is not recognizing that our solutions really need to be integrated. It isn't necessarily green design if it's a green building 30 miles out from town, right? And you got to drive there. The same goes for the types of strategies I'm going to be talking about. The other thing that's important to recognize is that these strategies we have to take account scale. So again, something that works well at the site, we also have to be thinking about the broader development pattern. Where is it located? So I'm going to start by talking about the first two actually together, because to me these two go hand in hand. Improving our development patterns and protecting natural infrastructure are really two sides of the same coin, and it comes down to figuring out where and how we are going to grow, and then at the same time deciding where we're not going to grow. So starting out, and again, I feel like there's people with the planning department, you guys know a lot of this, so you're going to be going, oh yeah, I've heard this before. But starting and thinking about where not to grow, pretty basic planning 101. Unfortunately, a lot of places don't always do this. But there are places in our communities and in our watersheds that are simply not suited for growth for a variety of reasons. And the reasons that a community decides it's not suitable for growth are going to vary from community to community. From a watershed perspective, flood-prone areas, riparian zones, ecologically sensitive areas, these all tend to be places where we think maybe it's better to try not to grow there. Of course, there's political considerations that I'm going to talk about later with all of that. So when we look to protect natural infrastructure, of course, we're trying to protect these large, contiguous areas of open space if we can, and to preserve and restore really sensitive ecological areas. So it's important to recognize not all land is sacred. There are places where it's okay to grow. And what's really important, though, is protecting those areas that are really critical. And this comes down to some just, again, basic conservation planning principles, things that you guys know. You need to have the capacity. In this case, often that requires an open space program and a watershed program as well. I understand you guys are kicking into another sort of round of watershed planning. Great opportunity to do some of these things there. Identifying and prioritizing areas that you want to protect. And then, of course, using the conservation and policy tools that are out there. And again, that spans the gamut from voluntary measures that are going to fly in a lot of communities, like easements and acquisitions, to policies that are not necessarily going to be as easy to get through depending on the politics of your community. And those can be different types of zoning, floodplain ordinances, and again, it runs the gamut. But the important thing is recognizing these things kind of fall together. And so then we move into how do we improve our development patterns. If we've protected the areas we don't want to grow, it doesn't mean we don't get to grow. Again, remember, there isn't a no-growth alternative. And I really look at this question of sustainable development patterns in terms of a couple things: the location, form, and design, and diversity of development. Location. Again, in this case, what we're really trying to do is direct and guide development to the most strategic areas, preferably areas where we're infilling and even better yet, getting some redevelopment potential to take place. On the side here, I've got some bullet points of different things that communities can do. I don't want to read through each of those, but suffice it to say that there's a lot of different things that you can do as a community to prepare yourself so that you're in better place to take advantage of infill and redevelopment opportunities when those arise. And we can talk, if people have questions about any of these while you see those bullets, feel free to stop me. But why is this better for water? Well, again, which location's better for the watershed? Infilling into that area within town, it's already pretty impacted, or somewhere out on the edge, greenfield area. Same thing, what's better, redeveloping this dead mall? Again, you're just recycling pavement in this case, or greenfield site. And redevelopment is actually, I think, probably the most underutilized and most important watershed protection tool there is. If there's one thing that you can do to protect your watershed, it's, from my perspective, especially when we're talking about growth, it's do everything you can to encourage redevelopment in the future.